Hi there. So this video is about comparing the False Chanterelle with the Chanterelle. Now the reason for this, or the purpose of this video, is to give you a visual comparison of the two mushrooms, even if you've never seen them before. Or if you've found one, then you can look and try and work out which one it is. They are actually quite different once you get used to seeing them, but if you haven't seen them before, they can look superficially similar. And the False Chanterelle is Hygrophoropsis aurantiaca. The Hygrophoropsis means it's similar to Hygrophorus mushrooms, and hygro means water, phorus kind of means retaining, so they tend to be hygrophonous, Hygrophorus. And what that means is that they take on water and the colour of their cap and stem will change depending on how wet they are. So that's kind of why they're called Hygrophoros or Hygrophoropsis, is similar to a Hygrophorus mushroom. The aurantiaca means orange because it has an orange colour. Now, False Chanterelle are very good for the forest. They produce a lot of oxalic acid, which helps break down the soil. They are sometimes listed as edible and sometimes listed as poisonous, but they are actually eaten in, for example, Oaxaca by the Zapotec people in the pueblos up there, and in other parts of Mexico, and perhaps other parts of the world too. So they are eaten by some people. And maybe the effects or the reports of hallucinations from this mushroom or poisoning from this mushroom come because there's another mushroom which can sometimes be confused with the chanterelle or the false chanterelle, and that's called the jack-o'-lantern. So Omphalatus olearius or Omphalatus illadens contains a poison called illadin S, which causes severe gastrointestinal problems. It's actually quite toxic, and they've derived a anti-cancer agent from this mushroom. So it's also a useful mushroom. Not that that matters. Nature is worth keeping and worth saving because it's beautiful and because it's part of us. We are it. Now, so there's three mushrooms then. Jack-o'-lantern, false chanterelle and chanterelle that can be potentially confused. In the UK, however, the jack-o'-lantern is extremely rare. So it's mainly the false chanterelle that you might get confused with the chanterelle. The jack-o'-lantern can be distinguished from the false chanterelle and the chanterelle by the fact that it grows on wood. So it grows on rotting wood. So it's a wood decomposing mushroom. Now that might sometimes be difficult to see if the roots are buried. You might not immediately recognise that they're growing on wood, on roots, like on actual wood. But upon some digging you should be able to find that out. Given in the UK it's very rare, and if you find that combination of characteristics, then you know it's likely it's a jack-o'-lantern. The jack-o'-lantern also has bioluminescent gills. Now many people have struggled to actually find this, actually observe this themselves, and have tried finding it. So apparently that varies quite a lot, the bioluminescence of the gills. And quite interestingly, it contains a compound which shows you how much mushrooms were maligned in the past, and this kind of held back mushroom research because they were maligned by the church and things like that. It contains a compound which they named luciferase, so an enzyme called luciferase, which breaks down a compound called luciferin in the jack-o'-lantern and causes bioluminescence. So, oh, it's Lucifer, you know, they're glowing in the dark, whoa! You know, so they didn't really understand nature back then. Now, so the jack-o'-lantern it's growing on wood. It's got a spore print that is white, sometimes pale yellow, whereas the chanterelle has an ochraceous spore print. So the spore print of those two might not be too different, but the false chanterelle has a white spore print. So in terms of poisonousness, the jack-o'-lantern is poisonous. but it's probably not going to be fatal. So there's no reports that I can find where people die from it. They just have severe gastrointestinal problems, diarrhea, headaches, you know, it's pretty bad. The false chanterelle, on the other hand, it's most likely edible. It's more related to the boletes than it is, say, to Paxillus involutus, which was previously what they thought it was related to. So it's probably edible and people do eat it. So personally, I would try eating it. And I think I'll try it next year because it looks like it's edible to me. And there's no like cases of like fatalities. There's a few reports of like hallucinations, but I don't care about that. So what we're going to do is, in the next parts of the video, I'm going to look at a false chanterelle and a chanterelle side by side to give you that visual comparison. Now it's worth consulting other books. If you're going to eat mushrooms that you pick in the wild, you need several reference books to compare with. But this will help at least assist you in some way. Now, the first example is going to be quite a poor example. This is because whilst they're very common in the UK, and I find them every year, sometimes I go to one wood and find the chanterelles, another time I go to another wood and find the false chanterelles. You know, I've been spent 3 hours in one wood and then I had to go home. So I struggled to get both of them at the same time. So by the time I'd got one, the other one had kind of rotted away. So they were quite poor by the time I made the video in the first example. But that's good because you might find them in that condition. In the second kind of part of the video, I find some much better specimens, so you can see what newer specimens look like when compared. And in the third part of the video, I try and do a spore print. So I show you how to do a spore print, but the spore print doesn't work. Well, it works for the chanterelle, but the false chanterelle ends up rotting away. And that kind of illustrates as well just how kind of crappy and insubstantial the false chanterelle actually is, because it rots away much quicker. Chanterelles are like virtually rot-free and rot-resistant. So I think I've said enough about that. Let's go and check out the comparison of these two mushrooms. Okay, so I hope that was useful, and
so which do you reckon is the false chanterelle and which is the chanterelle? Let's have a look at the fronts. Can you tell which one is which? Well, probably the more experienced among you will have recognised this is a false chanterelle. So even though these are in poor condition, it's reasonably easy to tell. Now, at a first glance, you could easily pick this, thinking it was a chanterelle, but on closer inspection, let's take a look. So the chanterelle is more yellow. This will be more orange-like, whereas this is a lot more yellow. Now, also, these gills they're going to remain wet for a lot longer, and they're very fragile kind of gills. They're not really very rubbery. The chanterelle's gills are very, very flat. They're barely raised above the surface and they feel quite rubbery. The cap texture is about the same. Let's split it in half and have a look at the flesh. There's the flesh of that. The flesh is actually quite similar. We don't have the stem on this one. You can see here that the cap, the pellicle of the cap, the pellicle of the pileus, is also yellow, whereas here it's not really pronounced at all. You can't really tell the difference between the cap and the flesh. Let's have a close look at the gills. So on the false chanterelle, you can see that these are gills. You know, they look like gills and they kind of behave like gills when you twist them around. And they're not very substantial, they're kind of pliable. Whereas on the chanterelle, see how they're not really moving about because they're a lot more fleshy. In fact, this is a lot tougher on the whole on the chanterelle. See that? whereas this is just, so this is softer. The False Chanterelle is softer than the Chanterelle. I've got a couple more examples here. So let's take a look at another couple of examples. Which is a False Chanterelle, which is a Chanterelle? Now from the top you probably can't tell. Can you tell now? Can you tell now? How about now? This is a False Chanterelle, and as you can see, again it's more orange. We've got some stems this time. The stem of the False Chanterelle is more orange as well. If we look at the gills of the False Chanterelle, we'll see that they've got that bifurcation. Now this looks really fantastic on a large specimen, and a large round specimen, but it branches and then branches again and continues to do that. But there won't be any, apart from that branching, there won't be any kind of random connections. Whereas if we look on the Chanterelle, you still get bifurcation, but if you look, the gills are not as crowded. Again, they're more substantial. Just take a look at them side by side. Look at the stems, how this one is more yellow and more consistent with the colour of the gills. But both the gills are decurrent and run down the stem. Let's take a look at the flesh inside these two. See if we can see any differences. So there's the False Chanterelle, and just behind the camera preparing the Chanterelle for you. There's the Chanterelle. You can see this has got a little bit of oranging in there, whereas this is a bit more substantial. So I've chosen these old specimens just because that's the ones I could find. But you might find old specimens when you're looking. On new specimens of Chanterelles, the kind of differences will be quite, well, a lot more pronounced, let's put it that way. And the Chanterelle mushroom will just feel a lot more robust. And you'll be able to tell by looking at the gills, you know, I mean, if we look at these the gills on the classic Chanterelle versus the False Chanterelle, you can see that these are just bigger. They're not folds, they are gills. And when you look at a variety of specimens, especially on the new ones of these that are more rounded, they'll just obviously be gills, whereas these are more like folds on the Chanterelle. As you can see, if you're a beginner, you're probably thinking, wow, they're quite hard to tell apart. They're not. Once you know what they are, and once you've seen them, it's kind of obvious. The only time you make a mistake is when you first look at them on the floor, and you might make a mistake. I've been caught out a couple of times, picked them up and been like, oh, False Chanterelle. I managed to find a couple of fresher samples. So which of these is the Chanterelle? Yeah, this is quite easy to see. So this is the Chanterelle. You can see it's pretty obvious from the back. You know, look, the gills are much more widely spaced. They're much more rubbery compared to these, which are gill-like. The stem is much more orange on the False Chanterelle, much more yellow here. This is completely more yellow. This is more solid than this. So there you go, there's a fresh example just to make it easier to see. Can you see the forking on here? You can see the forking here where it goes along, forks there, and then forks again. So this is called bifurcation. and repeated bifurcation or forking. Sorry, that's Cosmo in the background. He wants to play. Whereas here you get forking, but you'll see some odd things because it's a chanterelle. Like there, it's only forking into 3, and it's all irregular. Whereas the forking on here was actually pretty regular. They're all kind of forking at about the same place, and it looks a lot more linear and regimented than this, which is just kind of weird forking, and sometimes there's no forking, whereas the forking on here is consistent. So there you go, there's the chanterelle and the false chanterelle. There's one more thing we can do, which is to take a spore print, which is where we put these under cups of glass, leave them so that they drop their spores, because they've got slightly different coloured spore prints. So let's do that and then have a look at the result. So what we're going to do is just place these upside down on a sheet of white paper. And I'm going to just cut the base off like that so that it's can lay reasonably flat. And then we're going to put a tumbler or some kind of glass on top, just to stop them from dehydrating too much. And what will happen is these will continue to drop spores, and if we leave it overnight, that should be enough, that they've dropped enough that we can actually see a print on the paper, because they'll drop millions of spores. And we'll be able to compare the colour of those two and look at the differences. So let's take a look at that tomorrow. So if you just look at the base of those stems that I've cut off, you can see that the chanterelle is kind of white inside with the yellow edge, where this is orange. But we saw on a bigger chanterelle that it can also look a little bit white inside. But I hope you can see by now that they're actually quite different mushrooms actually.
So the video just ends there, and I don't show you the result of the spore print. That's because what happened is that the false chanterelle rotted, and it actually had maggots in it the next day. So it dropped a lot of liquid, and it was impossible to tell what the spore print was because it kind of stuck to the paper. The chanterelle had made a very light yellow spore print. So, sorry I haven't shown you that. But what I want to do is show you just a few spore prints, because I tend to collect spore prints from good specimens I find, because you can use the spores to germinate mushrooms. So here's a few examples of some spore prints.
So what I have here is some spore prints of different mushrooms, just so you can actually see what a spore print would look like. So this one is on foil, and this is of a St. George's mushroom. And the spores are very fine and they've kind of dissipated, so you can't really see any gill definition, because usually you see definition from the gills. You can kind of see it there at the edge. You'll see very clear gill definition on some of the other examples. So that's pale, but you can still see it. So you can still see the colour and see that that is basically white. So we've got another one here, and this was an oyster mushroom from Brothers Wood. And you can see the characteristic gill pattern of the oyster mushroom. And that is the spores. And the colour is being distorted by the camera, but it's kind of ochraceous yellow, perhaps slightly brown. So this is a spore print from a pavement mushroom, where there was just a part of a pavement mushroom, and you can see it's very dark brown, the spore print from there, and you can still see the kind of where the gills were there, where there's striations.
Now when you take spore prints, you get lots of different colours. You've seen in the examples we showed white on the St. George's mushroom, and then it was kind of an ochraceous yellow-brown on the oyster mushroom, and a very dark brown on the pavement mushroom. The spore colour can be critical in telling the difference between mushrooms, so taking spore prints is a good thing to start doing and getting used to doing, and looking at the different colours of the spore prints of the mushrooms, because sometimes that will be an identifying feature which is crucial to identifying the mushroom. So if we had the spore print from the false chanterelle and the chanterelle, the spore print from the false chanterelle is whiter than the spore print from the chanterelle. But unless you've seen both, if you only had a false chanterelle, taking the spore print and you're seeing it's kind of white, are you really going to know what it is? So you still need all those other features, those macroscopic features of the mushroom and everything. You need to combine all that information to get a good assessment of what the mushroom is. Anyway, I'm not entirely happy with this video, so it took me a long time to put this up. I filmed it most of it last year, and I'm filming this part now because I didn't find very good specimens. I couldn't find good specimens at the same time. The spore print didn't work. But this is just the reality of collecting mushrooms. I'll try again next season to get better specimens and maybe make a more succinct video. But I wanted to put something up because when I was first, several years ago, first looking at false chanterelles and chanterelles, I was really quite confused, and it took me a long time to work out the difference. So I think it's better to have some information out there than no information, and there's nothing misleading in here, so it's just perhaps not the best information you can get. Like, it could be, the presentation could be better. Having said that, I hope you found some use out of this, and I'll see you next time.